So we're here today for the Great Neck Library Oral History Project. Our first interviewee is David Aubrey, clerk here at the Great Neck Library. Today's date is Thursday, January 16th. Welcome, David.
Hello.
Hi there. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe one of your earliest or best memories of Great Neck?
Well, I've lived here for, since the 60s, and my earliest memories probably, of Great Neck other than my own house would be, I went to nursery school at what is, still standing, the community church, but it was, I don't know if the nursery school program was run by them, of which my primary memory is nap time on a rug, but subsequent to that, I went to the Kennedy School, elementary school, JFK, from kindergarten through 6th grade, and then North Junior, was junior then, not middle, and senior high school. So I have memories of the Kennedy School. Miss Warner was the principal the whole time I was there. It was a relatively new school when I first went there. I believe that it was originally supposed to be called the Red Brook School, but after Kennedy was assassinated, schools all over the country got named after him, and that was one of them. There were a lot more elementary schools in those days. You had this whole feeder system of the K through 3 schools that fed into the K through 6 schools that then fed into the junior and senior high schools. And there were 5 K through 3 schools, of which 4 of which the buildings survive and have been repurposed into other things. I believe 3 are used by the school district still for adult ed mostly, or other special programs. And 1, the Cherry Lane School, became a yeshiva in Kings Point. Cherry Lane used to feed into Kennedy. So in 4th grade, kindergarten to 3rd grade was a very different group of people, or was a certain group of people, and then in 4th grade through 6th grade, you had this whole other group that was added on. So like kindergarten through 3rd grade, there would be a few kids from Kings Point, but most of the kids were from Great Neck. A lot of kids from around Steamboat Road, larger like African-American population, and also like a lot of kids who's, from like firemen families and stuff. And then in 4th grade, you got all the kids from Kings Point, or almost all of them if you went to Saddle Rock. And so it was a much wealthier group of kids by and large, and that kind of changed the school somewhat. And then of course when you went to junior high, you got in those days anyway, it would have been all of Baker Hill, all of Kennedy, all of Saddle Rock, and half of the now defunct Kensington Johnson School, which no longer exists. Although there is still, I think, one gate entrance that still exists.
What were the cross streets for that?
KJ was on the border of Kensington and Great Neck Plaza. It was where Stoner Avenue reaches Bond Street, across from that. Right now it's the Portico, I think, or Portico Lane is what the street is called, but it's a set of like condos or apartments that are there that replaced it. Kensington Johnson and Arundel School were the 2 schools that got torn down in my lifetime that were regular kindergarten through 6th grade schools. Arundel had already closed by the time I started elementary school. Otherwise, Kennedy essentially replaced Arundel School, but the building still stood until I think late 70s or so. And I did go there for the summer program in like between kindergarten and 1st grade, or 1st grade and 2nd grade, something like that. So I was inside that building. I was never inside Kensington Johnson. although I went to school with people who went there, it was still existing then. But never sure what the Johnson came from. Kensington was self-evident, but yeah, so yeah, that was school. I can tell you about Kennedy School. My mother actually was in charge of cultural resources for the school. I'm not entirely clear whether it was just Kennedy School or the entire district that she was in charge of it for. It might have been both. It might have been Kennedy and then it was the entire district. But she got a lot of programs at the Kennedy School, so we had some famous or quasi-famous people that came.
Do you remember who? Some of those
We
people
had,
were?
I'm going to get the name wrong, it was something like Briscoe something. The guy, I don't know if you remember, there was a comic strip called Luther. It was one of the 2 or 3 pioneering African-American comic strips. Ran in Newsday for many years. And we had the cartoonist from that came and spoke. My mother was very concerned with diversifying the programming at the time. I remember we had that. We had Native American storyteller. I believe it may have been the woman who was famous, Princess something, who used to do it at Jones Beach for many, many years. It was a regular program there. I think it might have been her, but I'm not absolutely certain about that. I know we once had a speaker, I think this was after I went to Kennedy, but I remember he came to our house on the Armenian genocide. So it was like a representative from the Armenian community who we had over for dinner once in anticipation of that. And there were others besides, yeah, that was other memories of Kennedy School. We had periodically in the summer, I remember there would be bomb threats.
What year was this?
This was back in, we're talking the early 70s or so. But when I say bomb threats, these were not terrorist threats as we know them now. They probably consisted of kids calling in as a way to get out of classes by claiming that there was a bomb somewhere in the school. We'd all have to move out to the fields there and wait while the custodians would be searching on the roof for bombs, not necessarily the police. Sometimes it might have been the police, but we had of course there were the custodians and there were the crossing guard people. It was Winky was the main one of those that I remember. I remember teachers that were there. Some of the older teachers who probably didn't start out at Kennedy but taught somewhere else, and then when Kennedy was created, they were we had the older teachers that were the shop teacher was Mr. Seitz, and he retired and was replaced by Mr. Peck, who was there for a long time afterward. There was Mr. Hickey was the science teacher. I remember I built a crystal radio with him that could only get CBS and NBC AM simultaneously, and had to have a wire across my backyard to get it. And yeah, there were other I had Miss Westbrook for both 4th and 6th grade, most of these people are gone now, of course, but junior high school was a much larger group of people. And then senior high school, I remember I went to high school, or I should say junior high school, I guess, during the bicentennial year. Bicentennial was a really big deal. The whole nation, it was a big deal. And in the schools they had all kinds of programs in conjunction with that. mean, the junior high school did 1776 as their musical, and supposedly they, through connections that somebody had in the cast, they got the costumes from the original Broadway production to act in, although I can imagine that some of them might have been shorter than, one of the people who was in the cast later became famous, R.J. Cutler, who's a well-known director, played Jefferson in that. I had to interview him for some school project in conjunction with that. I remember two programs that just stay in my mind from the bicentennial program. One was we had a bridge designer who had designed the, I think the guy who designed the Verrazzano Bridge came and talked to us. I don't know if that was Hoffman or was somebody else. And I remember we had a guy who worked as a producer on the Superman TV, the old 50s seat Superman TV program, and he came and talked about Superman.
Do you remember his name?
I do not recall his name. I wish I did. He was an older guy. I could vaguely picture him. And I remember some kid asking about George Reeves, did he commit suicide or something like that, which was awkward. But other than that, let's see. There's all kinds of other things. There was massive school board controversy while I was going to school, which was the story that dominated Great Neck for about a year or two. Conflict between a new majority on the school board and the school superintendent, Mortimer Abramowitz. That made national news. I don't know if it would now, but it was a big deal at the time, and the community was quite up in arms about it at the time. But there's a whole history behind that I could go into. But I remember, in terms of other things in Great Neck, I mean, there are stores and institutions I remember that don't exist anymore.
What was one of your favorite stores to go to?
Well, when I was a kid, we lived in the old village of Great Neck, and we walked to stores, basically. We didn't drive much with my mother, and we would go to Bohack's, which was a supermarket chain which doesn't exist anymore. I think somewhere in my basement I've got either a can or a bag from Bohack's, which hasn't been in existence for at least 40 years, I think. That is where the Raindew Market is now in Great Neck, basically. On the way, you would have had Kings Point Stationery, also known as Dave's, although there was no sign saying Dave's, just the guy who ran it, I think, was named Dave. And that was a very popular place for kids to go and, shop for, get stuff, candy and things like that. Between the two of them, directly across from Arundel Avenue on Middle Neck Road, and nobody seems to remember this anymore, there was a larger store called the VCA, which was a kind of five and dime shop that you could get all kinds, like sewing stuff and all kinds of other things like that at. And we used to shop there all the time. That's long gone. There was for a little later, the Carvel was on that block. We're talking the block between North and Hicks. There were other stores going down the line there besides. There was a period in the 70s when that stretch between Arundel and Steamboat on either side was kind of Great Neck's South Bronx, if you will. There were multiple fires, several of which may well have been insurance fires that went up at the time. The fire department seemed to be very busy in that stretch. I don't know what about that particular stretch induced that particular activity, but there were several businesses that operated out of former houses then, occasionally hairstylists, other things like that, and they all seemed to wind up going up in flames at one point or another. There used to be, where there's the office building on the corner of North Road and Middle Neck, that was a vacant lot that had a shack in it for many years. I never went in that shack. I don't know what was going on there. There was, well, the Department of Public Works is essentially still there. Where that big apartment house is on the corner of Hicks, not Hicks, of Arundel and Middle Neck. On the Arundel side, there was a funeral home for many years, Fleetner Funeral Home, I believe. Never went in there. And then there was a row of houses along Middle Neck Road. I knew a kid who lived in one of those houses named Charles Bordeaux from high school. Then there were other houses and businesses along there. There were a lot more gas stations and supermarkets in Great Neck when I was a kid than there are now. Now you basically go up Middle Neck Road, there's one gas station on Middle Neck Road across from Allenwood. But there used to be a Sinclair gas station with the dinosaur sign on the corner of Ellard Avenue and Middle Neck Road. That later became a BP, I believe, and then it ceased to be a gas station, and they built what was like hardware store, big hardware store that then became a synagogue now. Then on Fairview Avenue, there was the Phillips station, I believe, that was behind the store that's currently on the corner of Fairview and Middle Neck on the south side. Small gas station. Then there were gas stations on the corner of Piccadilly and Middle Neck. And I think there were some gas stations further down than that. There was an Esso somewhere before Esso became Exxon, and then became Exxon Mobil. I don't know, I think they decided at some point that Esso was too European sounding, and they come up with Exxon. There was a big ad campaign about the changeover at the time. The whole bunch of other businesses that, there are types of businesses that don't exist in Great Neck anymore. There was a time when we had 2 independent bookstores. Yeah. The Magic Circle Bookshop and the Little Professor Bookshop. Now there have been others probably prior to that. One of them was on Grace Avenue between Bond Street and Middle Neck. One of them was in what I still refer to as the Gertz Shopping Center, which is now I think called Great Neck Garden or something like that, which is where Best was and the station branch is. So one of them was in that, and one of them was on Grace Avenue. And they had a pretty good selection of books. Later, they went out of business, and there was a chain bookstore in Middle Neck Road between like Elm Street and Cuttermill. I think it was a Dalton's or something. And then now there isn't any bookstore, of course. There were antique shops, shoe repairs, other types of businesses. The big restaurant that everybody ate at, but we didn't because we didn't really eat out at restaurants or barely at all. But the big popular hangout of that type when I was a kid was, I think, Squire's, which was across from Kensington Gate and just slightly north of that. I think I might have been taken there once with a friend or something when I was a kid once. But we didn't, as a family, we didn't eat there. There were several Chinese restaurants, a bunch of pizzerias in town that don't exist anymore. Scotto's was by far the most popular with the North high school and junior high school crowd. That is now, I think, a bank branch or something across from Everfresh. There was also Elio's, which had a connection to the frozen pizza, those rectangular ones. And Gino's, which still survives. And Roma down by the train station, which had, everyone agreed, pretty much the worst pizza, and closed shortly after a horrific crime occurred near there. What else?
What did you guys do for fun growing up?
Well, what I did for fun and what most people did for fun probably are not the same thing. I mean, they did all kinds of things. First off, people played outdoors, and they didn't necessarily have to. It was probably the beginning of making appointments for kids to play, but it wasn't exclusively that. People did play on the street. I lived on a dead-end street, so kids automatically played on the street in those days. They still do to some extent, not as much as they used to. So they would have played, various sports activities, but I'm not athletically inclined. I don't claim to be. And so that wasn't what I did. It would have also, but the one thing that would have been very different is there would have been a lot more kind of like exploring, if you will. First off, there would have been more wooded or undeveloped areas to explore. And if you were a kid, you might, you could like cut across people's backyards in Kings Point. You didn't necessarily take the road to get places. You would like walk across people's backyards, and they would not call the police or sick the dogs or shoot you or whatever, they might do now. I remember going with a friend to explore the entire length of Mitchell Creek, which ran from Kings Point Park out to Manhasset Bay or Long Island Sound. Something you could not do now, because you'd be going through a bunch of people's yards as well. And we climbed, we crawled through the tube that went under Bancroft Lane near Red Brook Road. It's a sort of private dead end there. We didn't crawl through the much longer one that went under Red Brook Road. We did that above ground, and then we would go like along the kind of marshlands, wetlands where it widened near Kenilworth. A lot of that has been developed since. So you really couldn't do that now. There was a time in the 70s when, and I did not witness any of this, and I don't know how much of this is apocryphal, when that was kind of a dumping ground for the mob for bodies. There were one or two occasions, I believe, where that actually happened in Great Neck in the 70s, until the development kind of closed that out and they had to go further out on the island to dump bodies.
Allegedly.
Until eventually, the whole island was kind of off limits for that. And, who knows, they probably had to rent a boat and things got more complicated and, mob is just not what it used to be. Anyway, there were, I'm trying to think of other big things. There was the Veterans Hall on Great Neck Road. There was also an ice skating rink there, I believe, like not a park district one, but another one, or maybe it was used for ice hockey. I don't know. Anyway, the Veterans Hall, I remember it had a bar. I only know about it not because I was there in that capacity, but because I think my synagogue might have used it as for like a bazaar or something like that. But of course, Great Neck had a much larger population of veterans in those days. So Veterans Day parades, Memorial Day parades were a big thing, and that went on for much of the day down the street. And there would have been a larger contingent of veterans to hang out at the place, but that's long gone. Another big thing that's different about Great Neck then is that there were a lot more streets that connected to other streets that don't do that anymore. A lot of the places where you now see gates of one sort or another, either a gate that can be opened or a gate that's like a full fence, that used to be through streets, particularly around Great Neck Plaza and the surrounding villages. And what invariably tended to happen, and it's a sad thing, is that if a kid got killed in a car accident on one of those streets or near one of those streets, they would then close that street. thereby causing the bottleneck that we now know to exist on Middle Neck Road, slowing traffic considerably down, quite probably saving lives in the process, but also rendering traffic much slower. Elm Street in Great Neck Estates, there's that gate just near Middle Neck Road. That used to be a through street. Hillside Avenue, I believe it's called, in Great Neck Estates, used to go all the way through as a street to Cutter Mill Road. So there was, like, between Bayview Avenue and Middle Neck Road, there was a through street off of, now that is Townhouse Plaza, and it's a dead-end street, and there's the fence, and then on the other side, there's Hillside Avenue in Great Neck Estates. So basically, the divide often came at village lines. That's where they would put it. Similarly, although I don't know that the root of this was anybody's death, there was the poles that were put up between Thomaston and Great Neck Plaza on Brompton Road and Knightsbridge Road. Those used to be through streets. So you could cut through. There were, in other words, multiple ways to avoid the passage through Middle Neck Road as it goes to Great Neck Plaza. And people drove a lot faster. The bridge over here got replaced because a kid was killed. There wasn't any sidewalk on the old bridge, I believe, or maybe there was just the one on one side. I don't know. I really don't remember that well, but it was a narrower bridge. And they took them like 2 years or so to replace that. We all had to go around Polo Road while that was happening in the early 70s. It was after I think it was after the library was opened in 1970. I remember the old library, which is now Great Neck House. Fortunately, the building still stands. It's a beautiful building. And the children's department was downstairs, and there was a separate entrance that you went in to get to that.
Did you spend time in the library when you were growing up?
Oh yeah, sure. We didn't hang out there much. We went there to get books at the old one there. Then in 1970, this one was created, so I was here from that time on, and 74 levels opened, and I was at the first year of levels. It's weird because I was there the first year for a short-lived cartooning group that they had, me and about 3 or 4 other people, and then that sort of ceased to exist, and I only went there for a couple of shows that I knew, like older kids that were in, and then I didn't go back from about 75 to about 78 when I started acting in shows there, and I was there after 78.
Tell me a little bit about Levels, because I remember you telling me about the performances there.
Okay. Well, it was run by Ed Amrine, who sadly died in 1983, I believe. It was, a place for kids to hang out. We did. I was mainly involved in shows, but I did, did hang out for other things, and I went to other stuff that was going on there. They sometimes had comedy nights, or my brother and a friend of his, both unfortunately gone now, did comedy shows there in the 80s, which I sometimes appeared in mainly as a straight man.
What were their names?
Jonathan Aubrey and Jeff Cohen. It was Cohen Aubrey Productions. Everybody seemed to want to have a production name, the kind of things that, like at the end of sitcoms when, sit, ubu, sit, that sort of thing, But I remember Danny Levine, when I was in his shows at Levels, it was Mr. Clip Productions. He had a giant paper clip that he wore in his pocket for some reason. Anyway, and we did all kinds of shows. The shows that we would have done then would have probably skewed like older Broadway in some cases than now, but actually, Levels in its early years did a lot of kind of out there shows. I remember seeing a production of the play Kennedy's Children, which was like an off-Broadway, long-running thing from the early 70s. There was a deeply controversial production of Jesus Christ Superstar in the mid-'70s that I never saw when they did that. I remember my brother, actually, even though he's younger, was in a show before I was, a production of Three Penny Opera that they did here, which was very well done at levels, which at one performance, and I wasn't there for it, I regret to say, supposedly Lotte Lenya from the original cast in Germany of Three Penny Opera showed up because she was a friend of somebody's or something to see. I don't know what her response to it was. There were other, I'm trying to think of other things at levels. They sometimes, would have like, bands that played there, folk or rock at various times. They had dance, they had other things. It wasn't as much computer stuff in those days, of course. There was art stuff as well. And I remember when John Lennon was shot on December 8th of 1980, they had a kind of big gathering there for all the kids that were affected by that. Other things. The library, there are other activities I remember at the library. They had a very active poetry society of some sort that had sellout events for poetry, where famous poets came. I remember, although I didn't see it, I remember Stanley Kunitz, who's a very famous poet, came once at least, and there were some other people. A woman, I think her name was Harriet, something like Harriet Zinnis or something like that, ran the program. They showed movies all the time. They showed old movies all the time. I saw all my first Chaplin movies at Great Neck Library. I remember seeing Captain's Courageous with Spencer Tracy here. And they showed more contemporary movies as well. They had a lot of other programs, history-related programs, things like that, literary things. What else? We had, let me think of other things in the town. There were, I can remember when there was a farm in Great Neck on East Shore Road where Cow Lane, across the street from Cow Lane, it was still an active farm. And that was, I think, until sometime in the 70s, maybe it was the early 80s, I don't know. Like I said, there was more open land, although, there was plenty that wasn't at the time. I can remember when a few streets were created out of existing land. Poplar Court along Steamboat Road, Hampworth Lane or Court, whatever, lit up near the point later on. Gatsby Lane was even later than that. I can remember when Plaza Center in Great Neck Plaza, that used to be a row of stores there, and sometime in the 80s, I think it was, that they tore down 2 or 3 of the stores and built a street going through in an effort, I believe, to ease the traffic that was caused by all those gates going up, closing off the other streets. Whether that worked or not, I don't know. There used to be a store in that path of stores called Gewgaw, Gewgaw. I remember the sign with those 2 words on it. I think that sold oddities or antiquities or something like that. I don't know. I don't know that I ever went in there. There was, what else? What other kind of businesses or stores or things were there? There was for many years, up until I think the 90s, there was a Spanish restaurant on Steamboat Road called Los Porches. Steamboat Road, of course, was the one street out of the Middle Neck East Shore orbit and Northern Boulevard that had stores. or that was zoned for that in those days. So there were a couple of stores there. There was Evans Exterminating, there was Los Porches, there was briefly a store on the corner in the 70s, on that building still stands, on the corner of Wood Road and Steamboat Road, called Rachmaninoff, Disraeli, and Gladstone, and it had glass paneled windows with pictures of the three of them. I have no idea what business they were in, what they sold, two prime ministers and a pianist composer. I'm not sure exactly what they had in common, beyond all being relatively homely looking guys, but
It was a memorable store there.
yeah, it just the people seem to come up with very interesting names for stores that didn't last very long in Great Neck. Yeah, over the years there were a bunch of those. In terms of celebrities in Great Neck, when I was a kid, the only celebrities that were, it was past the heyday of, that. There probably were a few that I didn't know about still. But Alan King was by far the most famous. And you would occasionally see his Rolls Royce with the initials AJK, and I forget if there was a number attached to that. And he might be in the back seat, and there was a chauffeur. And I remember seeing that parked around town occasionally, and seeing him in the back seat. I remember when Richard Tucker died, the great opera singer. It was the largest funeral in Great Neck history. He was, cultural hero, he was active in synagogue here and all of that. Professor Irwin Corey, the kind of anarchist comedian, lived in Great Neck. He later, I think, moved to Manhattan, lived to be 100 and something. And he lived in Great Neck. I don't remember seeing him around town, but we knew that he lived here. Later on, Vitas Gerulaitis lived in Kings Point, pretty close to the library. Famously had a pool in his backyard shaped like a tennis racket. I never saw him in person. I did, I think, once see Whitey Ford, who lived down in Lake Success. But other than that, there were, sometimes we would go over to a kid's house or something like that, and it would be the house of somebody famous from the past. I remember the school psychologist when I was in junior high school, I don't remember her name, but I remember she lived in what had been Chick Young's house in Kensington. And I think I was over at that house once.
The illustrator of Blondie,
yes,
right?
Yes, exactly. My sister's best friend lived for many years in Ring Lardner's house on East Shore Road, which still stands.
What was your sister's name?
My sister was Alana Aubrey. And there were other people occasionally who lived in somebody, I'm trying to remember any others. I remember once my synagogue had, some member of ours lived in Kings Point on what is now, since then, a newly created dead-end street. The name escapes me. Might be Horizon Way. But it was off of Kings Point Road. And we had an event at a house there. It had a grand sloping lawn down to almost to the water. And that had been the house that the Smith Corona family, or the family that owned, I don't know if they were named Smith and Corona, the people who owned the Smith Corona typewriter. And it was a beautiful old house, I believe it has been torn down since, that had natural air conditioning. It was a dark house that had the windows set up when it was built in the 20s or 30s, so that you didn't need air conditioning, that it would air condition itself. You could do that, with enough money, I guess, I lived very close to All Saints Church, so I was over there all the time. I knew the mayors. Gary Mayer was the reverend there for many years. He was also park commissioner for many years. And I knew his kids. They don't live in Great Neck anymore. And I was very familiar with the cemetery, which is the only big cemetery in Great Neck. We used to play in that cemetery.
That's All Saints?
Yeah, All Saints Church Cemetery. Before it got filled in with a lot more graves, we used to use the hill there as a sledding hill. Then there came a point where if you sledded, you might go headfirst into a tomb, gravestone. So you had to kind of slow down on that, and then the whole hill filled up with graves.
Do you remember the house that you grew up in, the address, the street address?
Well, I still live in that house, so I'm not going to give out the address.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, but it was near All Saints, All Saints was, it was being an Episcopal church. It, had a somewhat dwindling congregation in those days, but they had the Strawberry Festival every year, which they still have. It was kind of a bigger deal in those days. It would be the entire driveway of the church and then the parking lot in the back. And that parking lot, they would have rides and stuff like that. When the Strawberry Festival wasn't going on, cops used to hang out in that parking lot. Sometimes, the cemetery, used to explore the cemetery. I have no fear, and indeed a lifelong love of cemeteries, owing to my experience growing up near one, that probably most people don't have. I remember once my sister lost her hat in the middle of that cemetery in a snowstorm, and my brother and I had to go out with flashlights to search for it. Now, that's something that would probably scare most people, but it didn't scare us because we were very comfortable with cemeteries. I remember, you want an urban legend or something about that cemetery? There was a grave there of some kid that died when he was like 5 years old in the 60s. And I remember hearing this story because near that grave, you know how like sometimes there's a kind of raised stone thing that goes in like a rectangular square around the grave? Okay, well, there was one of those, and supposedly the story was that this kid, this 5-year-old kid, was walking, balancing on that stone thing that went around while he was sucking on a lollipop. And he fell from that great height of 2 feet or whatever it is, and swallowed the lollipop, and the stick from the lollipop cut his throat, and he was buried on the site. I don't know whether this was true or not, but it might have been. Anyway.
So that's all we have for today.
Okay.
We appreciate you coming in and sharing your wonderful stories. I mean, I'm sure that we could spend a much longer amount of time, and maybe we'll have time for a part 2 with David Aubrey.
Yes, absolutely. Part 2, Electric Boogaloo, whatever. Yeah, fine. Okay with me.
Very good. Thanks, David.
Sure.